All right, let's take a look at some common audio effects built into some of the DAWs. So there's a lot of them. Some are going to be specific, some are going to be general. There's usually an implementation of most of these available. There are too many effects to cover in depth though. So I'm just going to stick to the big ones that are common across most of the platforms. Keep in mind that names and interfaces will change from one to the other. Some DAWs will have additional killer effects that aren't available to others, like Ableton has grain delay, Logic has ring shifter, and Reaper has a ton of the JS effects and even more through Repack. But let's talk about shaping effects. How do you mold and sculpt the sound? We'll start with the compressor. The compressor is a dynamic effect that reduces the volume of a signal above the threshold parameter by whatever the ratio is that you set. This means that it makes the difference between the loudest and the softest volume significantly smaller, and then with makeup gain enabled, makes the overall sound output higher so that everything sounds as if it's louder. Threshold is where the gain reduction kicks in. So this requires a decent amount of analysis and listening in particular to set correctly. Ratio controls the amount of reduction in a ratio of x to 1. So for every x dB a signal exceeds the threshold, it will only output 1 dB. So for example, if you have a 2-to-1 ratio, if you go 2 dB above the threshold, it will only output 1 dB. If you go 4 above, it will only output 2 dB. Common compression ratios are typically something between 2-to-1 and 4-to-1, and anything of 10-to-1 or above is technically going to be limiting, which we'll talk about as well. The attack and release controls control how fast the compressor responds once it detects that that threshold has been hit. Now, there's a maximum dynamic level with the ceiling for limiting, and this is how it differs from compression. Once you set that maximum dynamic level with a limiter, nothing will output above that level. Hard and fast. If you set it to output at -1 dB, nothing will ever go above that. So essentially, the limiter is an extreme version of a compressor that's used to avoid clipping and is best put on the master track or on submix groups. On the limiter, the gain knob lets you boost the signal as it comes in, but before limiting takes place. Look ahead will change how quickly it responds to values that exceed the ceiling. I really recommend just using the defaults. They are usually fine for most applications. If you find that they are not, set up time to meet with me and we'll talk about it. But always keep the output slightly below 0 dB. Individual transients can still exceed it, but it will keep the majority of your mix from clipping. Related to the compressor and the limiter is the gate, also called a noise gate. This is, in effect, the opposite of a compressor. So, if a signal on a gate exceeds a threshold volume setting, it passes through the gate. If not, the gate shuts off and the signal is silent. So the return knob on a gate sets the offset between the threshold that opens the gate and the dynamic value that will close it. Higher return means less clicking with the gate opening and closing really fast when it's near the threshold, but this will also be partially determined by the release setting. The floor controls how much volume is subtracted from a signal when the gate is closed. -infinity or -70 or -120, depending on the manufacturer, means silence. -0 means that the signal will always be heard and your gate is effectively always open. Now, why would you want to use a gate? Well, it's really useful to get rid of ambient hum in a signal that you've recorded. Or if you are in a space that just has a lot of weird ambient reverb reflections and you're trying to get rid of those unless something's playing. It can sound fake if you are a little too aggressive with it though, so just be aware of that. Next is the equalizer, or EQ. This will typically have anywhere from 3 to infinite number of bands that you can put in. It is almost always going to be parametric, meaning you are using a collection of filters with adjustable Q values or bandwidth values and boost and cut gain for each band. They will also include high and low pass filters to further limit the sound and get rid of unwanted noises at either the low end or the high end of the spectrum. Most also have high and low shelf filters, which are going to be somewhat less drastic in that they take the signal that is either on the low or the high end and they boost it, but you can still use those to also do less drastic filtering if you really want to. They can have any number of bands, but 3 to 8 is the typical number. Again, you can go really crazy with this. Which one is it? There's one in Max MSP. I think I have like 32 bands. Essential for EQ is to keep in mind that you're going to use light alterations and that before you are going to try and isolate and get rid of a noise, what you need to do is to sweep the filter, which we'll go over in class, to figure out where the noise is occurring and then to remove a small band of sound around that or to boost a small band of sound. Generally with EQ, keep in mind that small changes are usually better than large ones, especially if the signal is going to be changing pitch over time. It's essential to use EQ to carve out a sonic space for each individual instrument. Filters are generally going to be used to also shape a sound. They're going to be a little bit more aggressive than the filters in an EQ though. In general, all filters have a cutoff frequency, which is where the filter takes effect. They also have a resonance or Q factor, which controls the slope of the filter or the width of the band for the bandpass and the notch filters. It also will add a boost at the cutoff point as you increase the Q, but it will then sharply cut frequencies after that point. If you overdrive it too hard, it can start to whistle, particularly on analog filters. So let's talk about the types of filters. The main ones are low pass, where frequencies that are lower than the cutoff pass through and are heard. High pass is the opposite. Frequencies that are higher than the cutoff pass through and are heard. Band pass is where frequencies centered on the cutoff with Q controlling the width pass through. So you might have center frequency here, and then the width will expand it. Everything within that boundary will go through, but everything off to the sides will get cut. And notch is the opposite of the bandpass. Frequencies centered on the cutoff, with again the width being controlled by the Q, are removed while frequencies outside of that region pass through. Next is time-based effects. These are going to be your classic things like echo, delay, and reverb. Delay is probably the simplest one. That copies the signal and introduces a slight delay in milliseconds to the copy. It then plays back both simultaneously with a balance controlled by the dry and wet knob. So keep in mind that sound travels at 740 miles per hour, which is about 1,130 feet per second. So this means that a 1 millisecond delay is the equivalent of just slightly over 1 foot, which can be multiplied accordingly to space out a signal to avoid phasing issues if you had a bad recording. But you can also create phase cancellation if you are not careful with that. So there's a number of different times that create specific delay effects. Anything above 100 milliseconds will create echo, where you hear the delay as a separate event from the original. 600 to 100 milliseconds creates slapback. It's close enough that delay overlaps on longer sounds, which is really good for filling out a sound or for covering up bad vocal performance. 30 to 60 milliseconds results in doubling. It's similar to hitting both strings on a mandolin or a 12-string guitar, but exactly in time. This doesn't usually do anything in terms of fattening as much as the lower 1 to 30 milliseconds does, but it does help to bury bad sounds in the mix. At 1 to 30 milliseconds, you have fattening, where the brain cannot separate the original and the delayed version, so it hears them as a larger image of the sound. And you can pan accordingly to create a larger, fatter stereo width of that. Next is chorus, which uses time-modulated delays to create the effect of multiple players playing a single part. 2 delay times can be set independently, or they can be synced to create a stereo chorus. The amount of modulation applied to the delay and the rate of modulation controls the overall depth of the chorus. Of course, these will vary on different implementations of the effect. But all of those will eventually have a feedback. That feedback takes the output of the chorus, scales it to a set percentage, and then puts that back into the chorus's input. So what happens with that? Well, it causes it to gradually create this loop where it's gradually lessening and lessening and lessening until it eventually gets to silence. And based on the amount of time that you've set for the delay, this could mean that you've got a really long effect, or it could be a really short one, just adding that feedback. Polarity, when it's available, controls if the modulation or feedback is applied as positive values or inverted to negative values. This has a profound effect on the sound, but most of these chorus implementations will only have a positive polarity and no way to change it. Typically, they will also have an internal low-frequency oscillator that you can use to modulate typically the rate of modulation or the feedback, occasionally both. Related to the chorus is the flanger, which is an extension of the chorus, but with a much more pronounced self-filtering effect. The big difference is that there's usually only one delay time and a feedback control, which delays the output of the flanger before it feeds back into itself after the delay. Well, why would you do that? Mostly because it creates a comb filter effect that, depending on your feedback level, can be, subtle and smooth and just get this kind of psychedelic vibe going on to the higher frequencies where they're swirling around inside your head, man. Or it can get really choppy and metallic and harsh and just, add some real craziness to your sound. And you can use it to funk it up. Chorus, flanger, wah pedal, classic funk. Most modules typically are going to also have an internal LFO, which can modulate the delay time. This gets really interesting because the delay time, when it's being modulated, is going to fluctuate like this, and that's going to affect what happens with the filtering. Set to extreme values with the LFO modulation, this gets really crazy. It can be a very fun effect. It's one of my personal favorites. And then also related to the chorus and the flanger is the phaser. This uses all pass filters to create notches in the frequency spectrum that then self-filter the signal after a minuscule delay. I mean, we're talking like 1 or 2 milliseconds. The result is that you get this swirling sound in the higher frequencies, but you don't hear much change to the lower frequencies. Controls are going to include the number of notches used to set the filter points and self-filter. Frequency is going to be the point at which the first of those notches is set. Typically, they're going to auto space based on however many notches you set after that, but they can have independent positions on some of them. Then feedback is the amount of the signal that's fed back into the phaser to create the filtering. And again, you'll probably have an internal LFO that's usually incorporated for modulation purposes. But this brings us to the classic, reverb. Reverb is a simulation of room echo that's created through delay networks. So not just one delay, but a bunch of them. The longer the delay time, the longer the reverb tail, the echo part. Wow. The tail is sculpted by things like the pre-delay, which controls the amount of delay before reverb kicks in, early reflections, which basically control the earlier parts of the signal, leading to different amounts of onset attack, and the diffusion network settings, which create the decay time of the tail and filter the reflections. Some reverb modules will have a freeze button, which is very cool, and when included can be automated to freeze the current reverb diffusion, creating effectively an endless sustain. It basically just takes the feedback and ups it to 100%. It will not stop until you then turn the freeze off, but also will not process new things until you turn the freeze off. There are a couple of different types of reverb. Artificial, for our purposes, is going to be using digital delays to create the effect. This could be modeled on things like plate reverb or spring reverb, but by and large, it's just going to use digital models to create a reverb effect by saying we're going to have X number of delays at X number of times at X feedback percentage, go. Now, however, we have convolution reverb as well, which uses impulse responses to mathematically recreate a physical space. It is vastly superior to artificial reverb in terms of quality. But let's talk about destructive effects. What if you want to degrade your signal and make it sound metal? Well, the first one is saturation. This is wave shaping that adds just a little soft amount of saturation to a signal, or if you crank it to the proverbial 11, can distort it and get nice and excessive and crazy. What's happening is that input signals are mapped to a control signal, which is then changed, and then that changes how they're output. This clips the waveform and adds different levels of distortion to the waveform peaks. Adjusting the drive, you can change the volume of the signal and allow for more or less shaping of the peaks. They generally are going to be using preset curves like a sine, a saw, etc. to map one signal to the output, but some will let you create your own curves, and then that will just throw everything into extreme ranges. You'll get some really crazy overdrive that way. Now, classic overdrive is taking a signal, driving it beyond the range of the system to create foldback distortion or clipping. This is going to take the waveform, which is normally nice and curvy and has different peaks and troughs, and it's just going to flatten everything. You're going to have a black bar of death. But this also is typically paired with volume reduction to keep your ears from bleeding. This is closely related to erosion, which degrades the signal by modulating it with band-filtered noise or a sine wave, which creates kind of a digital sounding artifact on the signal. But again, be sure to use the volume reduction feature. Otherwise, you'll notice that overdrive will dominate everything else in your mix. A little bit of overdrive is a good thing, but you have to pair it with volume reduction or it will dominate everything else. Finally, we have a really, really cool effect, one of my favorites, bit crushing. This takes your signal, your perfect, nice recorded violin, sounds like angels singing, and then reduces the quality so it sounds like it was played on an NES or an Atari 2600 or a ColecoVision or something even worse. It does that by downsampling. So you've got your set sample rate of 44.1K. Instead, what you're doing is you're removing every X numbered sample on the downsample. This creates angular distortion in the waveform. The higher the number, the more distorted it will be, because instead of having, all of these thousands and thousands and thousands of points, you now have a reduced number, and so it's going to jump from one sample to the next. And if you have more spacing, it's going to jump more and more. The waveform becomes more stepped and angular. Bit reduction is going to do the same thing, but for volume. Now, typically on a lot of the plugins, this is going to have a separate on-off switch, and you need to be very sure that you're going to do it for the very reason that if you are not careful, this will explode your volume. As you're downsampling, you are reducing the range of dynamics that it creates, and at the lowest possible setting, a bit reduction of 1, it basically means play as loud as possible 100% of the time at all times when a signal is going through. So you do not want that. you can do a little bit of bit reduction, and that will decrease the dynamic range and make things louder. But if you go down to that lowest possible level, it's going to be so unbelievably loud that you will probably be dealing with a little bit of hearing damage if you're not careful.